Good evening and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this event on blowing the whistle on media coverage of Julian Assange as part of this year's Media Democracy Festival organized by the Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in the light of a communication environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organizations and is characterized by insufficient plurality, diversity, and accountability. I am Benedict. I'm Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Sydney, and I'm chairing today's session. Today, the legacy and extraordinary role of WikiLeaks is even more relevant. In times where global media systems are becoming more concentrated, where press billionaires are setting the debates, and digital lords like Facebook and Google have become the new gatekeepers of information. WikiLeaks was founded in 2006 as an online platform for whistleblowers and the publication of information censored by public authorities and private actors. I don't think that anyone would dispute the incredible impact that WikiLeaks revelations had, not just to disconcert and embarrass power elites, not just to expose crimes in the public interest, but also for bringing renewed debates on free speech, digital encryption, and quest for better protections for whistleblowing to the mainstream. Just briefly, the WikiLeaks platform and the WikiLeaks fame became global in 2010 with the publication of the video titled Collateral Murder, and later the same year with the publication of the so-called Afghan war logs and the Iraq war logs. And you should remember that this revelation also entailed major collaborations with established newspapers like the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Spiegel. This comprised almost 500,000 documents and field reports providing an unprecedented account of the two wars and revealing thousands of unreported deaths, including many US Army killings of civilians. At the end of the same year, WikiLeaks and its partner newspapers began publishing select US diplomatic cables in what became known as the Cablegate. Now, as Cablegate brought WikiLeaks to the mainstream, the platform has seen constant attacks from both public and private actors, sustained attempts to shut down its operation, and even calls for Julian Assange, WikiLeaks publisher, assassination. It was the beginning of a very painful and dramatic journey for the WikiLeaks publisher, Julian Assange. So fast forward to today, to 2021, Julian Assange is still in London's highest security prison, Belmarsh, where he has been for almost 2 years now after spending almost 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. It was not just politicians who were always disgruntled with the platform, it was also the media organization most openly associated with WikiLeaks that quickly became its primary critics. Today, the United States is attempting to extradite Assange in order to prosecute him for publishing evidence of war crimes in 2010, for publishing stories that we should remember won him numerous journalism awards. He faces up to 175 years in prison. So this move has been condemned as a clear attempt by the US to criminalize what journalists do worldwide, and this is why it's so relevant for our festival. In the words of Reporters Without Borders, the extradition would set a dangerous precedent for journalists, whistleblowers, and other journalistic sources that the US may wish to pursue in the future. 2 months ago, on January 4, a British judge ruled to block the US extradition of WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange on grounds that he would endanger his life and put him at grave risk of suicide. To discuss the incredible relevance of WikiLeaks for journalism, freedom of speech, whistleblowing, and human rights, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. We start with Jennifer Robinson, who is an Australian human rights lawyer and barrister. Thank you, Jennifer, for being with us at Doughty Street Chambers in London, practicing in the areas of media law, public law, international law, and extradition. She has been a member of the legal team acting for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks since 2010. Jennifer will provide us with an update on the legal case, of course, its chilling effect on journalism worldwide, the impact of WikiLeaks on access to government information and human rights. Then we have Peter Kronau, who is an investigative journalist, most recently a producer for ABC TV investigative documentary program Four Corners. His forthcoming book is titled The Base, Australia's Secret Role in Americans' Global Wars. Peter is going to talk to us about the reflection and findings coming out of the recently published book that he headed with Felicity Ruby and a major editorial success, A Secret Australia, revealed by the WikiLeaks expose that he just finished editing. And then we have Andrew Fowler, who is an award-winning investigative journalist and reporter for the ABC Foreign Correspondent and Four Corners programs. His book on Julian Assange is titled The Most Dangerous Man in the World and has just been revised and republished. Andrew will shed light on the chilling effect of state surveillance on journalism, the impact of the Five Eyes Alliance and the loyalties of Australia and the UK to the US in this context. Each of our guests will speak for about 8 minutes, and then we all come together for a discussion. If you would like to ask questions, please add them to the comment stream on the platform you're watching on, and we will take as many as we can. So, Jennifer, we will start with you. Can you give us an update of the legal case and what's happening?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And well, good morning from Australia, where it is very early. And thank you very much for hosting me, and thanks to Benedict for chairing. It's great to be with you all. As Julian's lawyer, and I have been working with him for over a decade now, since December 2010. I just want to remind everyone it's been almost 2 years now that he's been in a high security prison, first in respect of the bail conditions sentence that he faced for 6 months, and ever since then on remand in respect of a US extradition request. And the US extradition request, which was earlier mentioned, in respect of which he faces 175 years in prison. Now, it's been a very long time we've been warning about this outcome, and unfortunately, it is the worst I told you so that I can really imagine. So I always think it's really important to remember the publications for which Julian is in that high security prison in London, and to remind people just how what a travesty it is that an editor is being held in a high security prison at all, let alone an editor who is in that prison because of the very same publications for which he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and has won journalism awards the world over, including the Walkley Award for most outstanding contribution to journalism here in Australia, which is effectively our Pulitzer. Where we are in terms of the hearing at the moment, I do think it's important to remember the publications themselves and the impact of those publications, because without talking about what it is that he's being prosecuted for, we can't understand really the chilling impact, not just for freedom of speech and for journalism, but also for human rights advocacy around the world. So just a mention of some of the important publications, and we had evidence of this in his extradition hearing last year. Julian has been prosecuted in respect of the publication of Cablegate in December 2010 into 2011, which of course was the publication of US diplomatic cables. He's also being prosecuted in relation to the publication of the Iraq war logs, the Iraq rules of engagement. Now, those publications capture not just the Iraq war logs themselves, which showed evidence of torture and war crimes in Iraq, and the murder of many more civilians than the US government had been reporting. But of course, the Iraq rules of engagement relate to the collateral murder publication, which is of course the video that we've all had a very visceral reaction to, which shows evidence of a potential war crime, the killing of civilians and indeed 2 Reuters journalists in Iraq. He's also being prosecuted with respect to the Guantanamo Diaries. Now, those publications showed incredibly important evidence of human rights abuse, corruption, and war crimes the world over. Just to list a couple of the, I think, important publications which we had evidence of in his extradition proceedings, I think as we approach the anniversary of the Iraq War, I can't not talk about the Iraq publications, both with respect to collateral murder, which of course was evidence of a war crime, but also in relation to the evidence of war crimes and human rights abuse by the United States in the diplomatic cables as well. And we had evidence before the court from an expert on international relations and issues around war and peace and security, who gave evidence about the importance of those publications in changing the public's perception of those wars, but also indeed in ending the war. So Julian spoke about this at the Iraq Warlogs publication, saying that, well, if lies can start a war, then the truth should be able to stop it. And ultimately, it turns out that he was right, because it was the publication of war crimes and the outrage that caused within the Iraqi parliament, which led to the withdrawal of immunity for US troops in Iraq and ultimately the withdrawal of the American forces from the country. Also within those publications, we had evidence about the Chagos Islands, which of course we used as lawyers in the Chagos Islands case. It was used by the Chagos Islanders in their domestic legal challenge in the UK. And as a result of those cases, and in particular the challenge before the UK Supreme Court, WikiLeaks cables are now admissible as evidence in human rights cases around the world. They've been cited in international investment disputes. They've been cited in the European Court of Human Rights, including in the case of Khaled al-Masri about torture and rendition by the CIA. So we're talking about publications which have massive significance, not just for journalists, but for the human rights community around the world. And that's just to name a few of those publications. In terms of where Julian's case is at the moment, he remains in prison despite having won his extradition case in January. Unfortunately, that is a decision which, as we've spoken about widely and publicly, it isn't much of a win for free speech, but it is the right outcome, perhaps for the wrong reasons. So on the 4th of January, the judge handed down her decision in the extradition challenge, finding that his extradition, barring his extradition, on the grounds of the Section 91 statutory bar, that it would be oppressive to extradite him. And the reason for her decision was because of the particular mental health conditions that he faces, his depression, and the high likelihood that he would be a suicide risk and would in fact commit suicide if he was extradited to the United States, both because of his particular mental conditions, but also because of the harsh prison conditions he will face if extradited to the United States. Now, the US administration, the Trump administration, immediately announced that they would be appealing that. Normally, if you were facing a US extradition request like this, you would have been granted bail by now. Julian has not. He remains in prison. And even having won his case, the US is seeking to appeal it and opposed our bail application. So even though this is an extradition request that was issued by a Trump administration which is no longer in power, in circumstances which have been universally condemned by free speech groups as a dangerous precedent for free speech, a chilling precedent for free speech, he's in fact won his case on effectively humanitarian grounds, that he is a suicide risk. And even so, he remains in a high security prison where he is at risk of contracting COVID, where there have been numerous COVID deaths, and he has been refused bail. The US has filed its ground of appeal, and our team is due to respond by the end of this month. The matter will be heard for a permission hearing before a single judge in the High Court, who will determine whether the US appeal will go ahead. Now, this case raises fundamental questions, as you've heard, not just because of the chilling impact on human rights reporting and human rights accountability, because of the nature of the publications for which he's being sought, but also because of the precedent that this sets for journalists and editors around the world. So we are dealing with a situation, and this is something that I've been saying like I'm a broken record since 2010, where the US is seeking to extradite a publisher from outside of the country for having published truthful information and evidence of human rights abuse about the United States. Now, that creates a precedent whereby any journalist or editor anywhere in the world could be sought for extradition and returned to the United States. Not only that, the US said in its extradition case before the courts in the UK that they may well run an argument that Julian does not benefit from First Amendment protections because he's a foreigner. So not only is the US seeking to exercise jurisdiction over editors and publishers anywhere in the world, but not only will they exercise extradition, exercise jurisdiction, that you will not benefit from First Amendment protections. Now, that is a terrifying precedent. For those reasons, that's why this case has received universal condemnation from the New York Times editorial board, from the Washington Post editorial board, from journalists, from the International Federation of Journalists, from journalist unions around the world, from the National Union of Journalists in the UK. And even so, we're in a situation where he remains in prison under a Biden administration, What we are hoping for is that the Biden administration reverses the decision of the Trump administration and puts this case to an end. It is a case that sets a dangerous precedent and should never have been started in the first place. And it is now for the Biden administration, which has committed itself to free speech and committed itself to human rights around the world, to put an end to this case and to let Julian get on with his life. I just want to emphasize the impact that this has had, not just on Julian, but on his young family and his partner. Stella has been a remarkable support to him, and has 2 young children with him who really are desperate for their dad to be able to come home. And this is, I think, in many of the policy and principal discussions that we have about this case, sometimes it gets lost that this is a human being who has been under some form of restrictions on his liberty for over 10 years because of publications for which he has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for successive years. This is a grave injustice and one that needs to be brought to an end. And I certainly hope that the Biden administration will turn their minds to this case and do the right thing. I think I've probably taken up enough time, so I'll hand over to Benedict.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's really hope that the Biden administration, reconsiders quite quickly, actually. So we'll move now to Peter Konau, that is going to give us a talk about the lessons and the recent findings from the excellent book that has just recently been published, as called and titled "A Secret Australia," revealed by the WikiLeaks expose. Peter.
Thanks, Benny. Hi, everybody. Look, I've worked at the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, for about 20 years. And I remember I had a discussion with a group of young journalists a while ago. And we were talking about the coverage of international affairs, in particular, the coverage of China, the sort of reporting we were doing on China. And with China, I'm not sure if it's the same in the UK, it's become quite a hot topic in Australia, where there's been a ramping up of saber rattling and concern about potential military conflict with China down the track. And the media's got a part to play in trying to get the public on side for any future conflict. So, we were quite aware of this and we were discussing it. And one of the things I said to this group of young guys was, and they were guys, was that, we've got to watch out that we don't repeat the mistakes made over the reporting of WMD. And one of the smartest young journalists in the group turned to me and said, "What's WMD?" And, I was bowled over, absolutely stunned that the most egregious failure of Australian journalism, which was the hyping of the non-existent weapons of mass destruction, WMD, in Iraq in 2003, was not in mind in terms of reporting of future potential wars. It was a terrifying reminder that 30-year-old journalists, ancient history, it's ancient history, things 20 years ago. So I just saw that the young journos were very vulnerable to the new wave of propaganda, and as a result got thinking about a potential book. And in discussions with co-editor Flick Ruby, we decided that there'd be a place for a book on what WikiLeaks has told us, what it's told us about Australia. There's been lots and lots of stories published about where the revelations about WikiLeaks, but they're in the newspapers and on television, and they're gone tomorrow. So we thought it'd be good to try to pull together some of the main things that we'd learned, and not to forget them. And so we did. We contacted 18 odd people, not odd people, they're quite pleasant people, and asked them to contribute. Very enthusiastic. It was pulled together. It was published in December. And if I'm not wrong, that's the book there that has just been published. And you can get it, international booksellers online, Kindle, whatever you need. So what WikiLeaks showed Australia is that power operates quietly behind the scenes to arrange the world for their benefit, and the examples just flooded out of the fingertips of the people that wrote those chapters for us. And there are examples of how politicians and military security services, how large corporations, the mining sector, how the US government manipulates Australia to get what it wants, to step around our democracy and to ensure that Australia complies with their requirements. Now, one particular document that I took a particular interest in had been leaked to WikiLeaks maybe a couple of years ago, and however, it hadn't been picked up by any media, and was languishing on the WikiLeaks website. And I've got to say, there are so many amazing documents still able to be unearthed on the WikiLeaks archive. People should jump in and just chuck in keywords and have a look. It continues to blow my mind. So the document that I thought was quite significant, said a lot about Australia, was a formally classified document. Well, not classified anymore because it was on the WikiLeaks website. It had been prepared by the Australian military. It was titled Australian Defence Force Information Operations Planning Manual. It's 86 pages long. It details how information operations, psychological operations and propaganda are used by the military, by the Defence Force of Australia, to keep the public in foreign countries on side and to keep the public in adversary countries wrong-footed. But it also detailed how the information operations techniques, social media manipulation, construction of news stories, cyber war, were being used against the domestic population at home in Australia. An extract from the manual, I'll read a couple of short sentences, shows how the military works to influence Australian public opinion. Basically, what they want to do is to unleash the military, to keep wars going, and to keep the truth away from the public, to maintain the national effort. Here's a quote. In times of tension and conflict, the maintenance of Australian domestic support and an understanding of military operations are of great importance to the maintenance of the national effort. So the document recognises that there's an annoying thing called the public and democracy, and it shows that the military fears public opinion, because an informed public aware of the ugly side of war may actually want to bring the troops home. Another short quote from it, it'll be my last, so don't worry, I'm not going to read out too much. It says, should the Australian public lose confidence in the ability of the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, to bring a conflict to a successful conclusion, restraints may be placed on the government and the ADF, the Defence Force. The results of loss of public confidence include a perception by the international community of the political weakening of Australian resolve. Now, those couple of sentences tell us a hell of a lot about why they're conducting psychological operations, information operations on the Australian public. And it explains that Defence Department media releases, media tours, interviews, photo opportunities, jet fighter flypasts, journalist embeds, escorted trips, they're all provided, not for democratic transparency and oversight alone, but they're designed specifically to keep the Australian public cheering on the war effort. The leaked document shows that it has to, the military wants to, quote, actually says, to avoid having restraints placed on it by the public knowing what's going on. Democracy, that sort of thing. The overriding aim is to condition the public to maintain support for Australian involvement, particularly in American military operations. The manual puts it to avoid the perception by the international community of the political weakening of Australian resolve. Well, That basically means, when it says international community, basically means America. That despite the public, despite the media, despite democratic institutions, Australian support for international military actions must be maintained. That's the overriding goal. That document reveals it. We've suspected it. It shows that this operation is conducted on the Australian public, and the targets are the media, the public itself, politicians, and the result is that Australian journalists find it very hard to report on defence issues because it's so manipulated, so constructed. It's very hard to do a story from inside. The access given, is actually a distraction. What that manual shows us and warns us about is the way that future wars are going to be managed. I mean, it's their own document. The conflict that seems to be looming with China being ramped up pretty regularly. And there are bases for concern with the relationship with China. I mean, there's the democracy crackdown happening in Hong Kong, with the Uyghur. I mean, there are issues, and however, those issues are being manipulated and used to create support for future Australian military operations. Now, recently, I'll give you an example of the sort of thing the Defence Department likes to do here. There was recently a media headline that blasted out, and I'll read it. Chinese warships arrive in Sydney as Beijing warns. 3 Chinese warships have arrived in Sydney Harbour amid increasingly strident rhetoric from Beijing over its territorial claims in the South China Sea. Very ramped up, very provocative. It then included, the reports appeared in many media outlets. It then included a report, a quote from a highly decorated Chinese general who stated the People's Liberation Army has no intention to cause any trouble, but it's not afraid to face up to troubles. So by linking the ships in the harbour to a provocative statement by a Chinese general, it basically said, we're on the doorstep of war. It ran prominently across most of the mainstream media outlets in Australia, and it was June 2019. It turned a friendly routine naval visit by a friendly couple of ships from the Chinese Navy on a scheduled goodwill visit to Sydney into some sort of threatening surprise attack warning by China. The Defence Department had actually approved that planned routine visit 4 months earlier, but had manipulated the media and the public by not announcing the routine visit until the ships were virtually in Sydney Harbour. In that report I've just mentioned, journalists and their senior editors have taken the assertions of the Defence Department at face value, and emboldened with this idea of national security, they reported those assertions uncritically. And honestly, the first battles of the next war with China are already being fought. They're being fought through the Australian media. So from that classified ADF Information Operations Planning Manual that was leaked, we found out that there's planning behind this. This overhyped warmongering stories that we're beginning to see more of in Australia are not just random. So credible news outlets are being used to wash the Defence Department message. And we know that by having seen the WikiLeaks document, the ADF documents published by WikiLeaks. So that's the sort of thing that the book.
So Peter, basically, WikiLeaks is helping once again us to understand, the level of the lack of criticism. Also, the fact that the media are constantly embracing, at face value what the Defense Department is actually telling them. And I need to move now to Andrew. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we'll have plenty of time to go deep into this this topic, because in fact, what also Peter has highlighted is that WikiLeaks is still also a great archive for new, fresh stories, precisely as the anecdote about the sort of propaganda department, to defend military operations. And now with Andrew, we're going to be discussing another very and fascinating story, which comes again from from WikiLeaks and the WikiLeaks revelation about really the loyalties between Australia, the UK, and the US, of course, and also the level and the extent of state surveillance and the chilling effect it has on journalists, and like also following up on what Peter just told us. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thanks very much for having me on the program. I first met Julian in 2010, and something that struck me about him was that he had a great belief that if we could expose the secret activities of government and the military, somehow we would be able to, they could self-correct, and that people would hold them to account, and that the world would be a better place. And I believe that that's what really drove him, that real belief in secrecy was the enemy of all of us. And what Daniel Ellsberg told him was that just the contrary would happen. The more we pushed back against the military, the more we pushed back against the governments and the secrets that they held, the more they would become strident, the more they would try to hold their secrets secret, and the more aggressive they would become to all of us, particularly those that challenge whistleblowers and journalists. And I reckon that Ellsberg was right about that, because certainly since 9/11 here in Australia, we've had 54 separate pieces of legislation, probably more by now, which have targeted the work of journalists and the work of whistleblowers. And the problem that we have is that in Australia particularly, we have no protections. Unlike the UK, which has some kind of implied protection through the European Convention on Human Rights, and the United States, which has a First Amendment protection, here in Australia, there's nothing of the sort. There's no Bill of Rights. There is no protection whatsoever. Let me give you an example of that. ASIO, which is the Domestic Security Intelligence Organization, has the power to secretly arrest journalists and to try them in secret and to jail them through a judicial process, of course, without the journalists having been forewarned that they are to be arrested or that they have any rights, for 5 to 10 years for revealing information about what's known as a secret intelligence, a special intelligence operation, an SIO. And these SIOs are things that we don't know about, and if we find out about them, then you're in breach of the law. So you can report, say, a complete cock-up by ASIO, in which many things happen, in which people are damaged, in which people may well have been killed. If you report that, you can be arrested and jailed for doing just that. Such is the protection of our secret intelligence organization here. And there is no defense, as far as I understand it, to publishing material in that matter. What we're doing in Australia is slavishly following the rules and regulations introduced around the world by the other so-called Five Eyes organizations, of which Australia is part, and particularly following the United States of America, such as the close relationship between this country and the US. And something that I think Assange quite rightly described as, he said at one time that Australia was the suburb of Washington. And I think that's quite right. That's quite rightly put. As an example of that, let me tell you about 2010 and 2011, when WikiLeaks released the series of documents we've already talked about. The Prime Minister at the time, Julian Assange, described it as a crime. and she called in the federal police. She said that Julian Assange had broken the law. That's the Australian law for releasing information about the crimes, evidence about the crimes of America. And the federal police investigated and found nothing of the sort. But that didn't stop the Attorney General, Robert McClelland, for threatening to withdraw Julian Assange's Australian passport. So here's somebody who's published material about a foreign power, and the reaction from his own government is to threaten to make him stateless, to withdraw his passport. Now, luckily, there was a person called Kevin Rudd, who was foreign minister at the time, and he said, well, it's up to me to decide who does and who does not get to lose their passports. And he, despite the fact that much of the WikiLeaks cable, many WikiLeaks cables revealed some rather unsavory comments made by Rudd about China, he still stood by the idea of freedom of speech and the right of journalists to disclose information. When you're looking at the effect of this kind of attitude on investigative journalism, let's look at WikiLeaks releasing, for example, a document which showed, it was a British military Department of Defense document, which showed that journalists were listed along with spies and terrorists as being a threat to national security. So investigative journalists doing their job, exposing evidence of war crimes, are seen as being a threat to the state order. Now, the problem you have with this is what kind of message does that send to journalists who are doing their daily job? Not even those that are actually doing the hard work, if you like, of digging into the sort of stuff that Peter Crono was talking about, and I've worked with Peter on a number of stories in this area. But it's people doing their daily jobs as journalists. What sort of message does that send? You've got a choice of looking at reporting on something, say, for example, like corruption in the government. Or you can maybe report on where the United States is keeping its nuclear weapons in Southeast Asia, and whether or not they transit Australia, whether or not they send their nuclear weapons to this country for storage in any secret way. I ask you the question, which one do you think the news editor is going to go for? They're going to go for the quick hit, easy corruption story, which may cause you some political problems, or are they going to go for a story which could see you extradited to the United States and possibly face 175 years in prison? I know what the answer is, and the answer is that they go for the first one and not for the second one. And that's because they're intimidated. They are chilled by these laws, which reduce the ability of journalists to do their job, to hold governments and military and the powerful to account. That's the take-home message for what we've got ourselves into and what we're up against, and how Assange said all those years ago that exposing information inside government to the public interest or the public benefit was what journalists were all about. And he was absolutely right about that. But he knows now, and as we know as well, that it's a hard and heavy road. And he's paying the price for that, being locked up in a terrorist prison for murderers and terrorists, for merely doing his job as a journalist.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew, and to all our speakers. We have many questions that are rolling in, keeping coming in. And I'll start with one for Jennifer, which is actually, well, they're asking if Julian is able to watch us tonight. And also they're really asking how positive you are about, the case and the fact that the Biden administration would probably decide to change their mind on the prosecution.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Julian will not be able to watch this. He has very little access to the outside world and certainly does not have a laptop or an internet connection. So sadly, he will not be able to participate in this or any other event like this, which I think is something that is a great shame, because his intellectual work and critical thinking around the issues that are of relevance to this conference are obvious. His writings are relevant, and I think we miss out on having his public voice because he's in prison. In terms of the prospects of the Biden administration closing this down, unfortunately, in my experience of this case, what the US government should do and what they actually do are two very different things. And so I certainly have hope that now the Biden administration has been in power for some time and is starting to look at different issues. Of course, in the first month of their administration, there was a lot to deal with, particularly after events in the Capitol in January. I think it is unrealistic to think that the Biden administration will have made an active political decision about this case already, but we're hoping that they will turn their mind to it and take the right decision, which is to put this case to an end, not just for Julian and because of the situation that he personally is in, but because of the impact that this will have for the rest of the media. You have a media like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the mainstream media, the ACLU, major human rights groups, major free speech groups across the country calling for this to be put to an end. And if the Biden administration is serious about free speech, then they ought to do that. But the question of whether they will or not is a separate one. So I hope we'll see a change in position soon.
And then we have a very interesting question actually coming from the public, which is, could whistleblowers from the media coming forward to help change things? So whistleblowers from the media institutions, or are they likely to outcast and experience a smear campaign as Assange is? So maybe both Andrew and Peter can address this.
Whistleblowers from the media. Well, they don't last long, I would suggest. There's been a couple of spectacular examples in Australia of young journalists speaking out about the censorship and the pressure on them, and they've had to find other careers. They don't last, and that's a sad reality. I mean, there is a groupthink that happens that means that journalists get on board with establishment thinking, to preserve their position. So. Speaking out is fraught with any organisation. Anyone inside the media speaking out faces enormous pressures to get on board, basically, to get on board with groupthink, to get on board with the corporate position. They don't need to receive a red letter censorship note. They absorb through osmosis the views of the corporation or the newspaper or the organisation they work for, and as a result, through groupthink, through peer pressure, people generally comply. There are a lot of battles that go on inside media organisations for people to try to get out better versions of the truth, more accurate versions, closer to the reality of what's happening. But I cast my mind back to reporting in the past, and you get jumped on, and it's very difficult for people to point out, the problems inside the media, and to do it when they're employed. They'd be sacked. It's against the work conditions and contract of journalists. People are expected to be loyal to their organisations, so they suffer. Journalists suffer the same pressures, the same difficulties in going public as anyone else in any other organisation. So that they need ways of going public, though, that's for sure, because there's a lot happening in media organisations to suppress the truth.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's right that, you say media organisations. I think when you look at, say, an organisation, you look at the ABC. The ABC is not the ABC. It's made up, like any organisation, of hundreds of people. And so you have to look at the individual. And inside organisations, as Peter talks about there, and we work together on Four Corners, there are many strategies involved to get your story to air. And sometimes there's kind of, if I can use the word, covert activity inside organisations to bypass the restrictions that are placed on you to get your story up. Having said that, a whistleblower inside a media organisation is frowned upon. I think one of the reasons why whistleblowers themselves are very often frowned upon by media organisations is because media organisations, any organisation, doesn't like people blowing the whistle on them. So if media organisations encourage whistleblowing, they're actually going to be encouraging people to blow the whistle on them as well. Having said that, my advice to whistleblowers inside media organisations is to stay there, is to remain inside and to leak actually information out to other more friendly organisations that maybe are more hold your point of view rather than coming out and blowing the whistle. Come out and blow the whistle, you won't have a job very long. Excuse me, there was a classic case of an Australian journalist, that's the newspaper, who blew the whistle inadvertently by telling the truth about the pressures inside the Murdoch organisation. And he was talking to a group of students who, dutifully, being good journalists, published everything he said, and he thought it was not to be disseminated. It was, and he lost his job, but he got a job somewhere else. But that's unusual. Mainly, you're just removed, and then it's hard to find another job. So my advice is to stay inside, leak, work against the organisation if they're running against you, and try and get your stories up by getting around editors that stand in the way, and try to do that.
Thank you, Andrew. So, does ownership of the media, ask one person from the audience, affect the journalism that comes out, and affect how little Assange is supported by established media? And then also they want to know about your view about the treatment and the reporting on Julian by The Guardian.
Sorry, are you asking me? Peter.
Oh, okay. I mean, I would just say that, yeah, ownership absolutely is a major restriction on what sort of stories get through the media. It's one of Noam Chomsky's and Ed Herman, who wrote Manufacturing Consent. It's one of the 5 filters on the media that prevent truth, or restrict truth getting out. And ownership has got so much to do with it. I mean, we've got Rupert Murdoch in this country and in your country, who is such a well, look, I see him as a cutout for the US administration's point of view. He's just the mouthpiece for US policy, and therefore it does all the things necessary to be done, beats up fear, creates leaks information on behalf of the United States. It does whatever's the administration and its deep dark recesses may require of it. It's an evil influence, and there's a lot of pressure in Australia at the moment to get a royal commission up, an inquiry into the effect of media ownership in Australia, including the Murdoch empire, which really is sinking, well, climbing to new lows. Could I say that?
Certainly, yeah. We all agree that it's climbing to a new low. Andrew?
My view on Murdoch is that Murdoch is not really a political figure. He is just into power and money. So whatever he can do to get richer and more powerful, he will do. On the question of The Guardian, yeah, I mean, The Guardian's got a patchy record on this. There's no doubt about that. It was The Guardian reporters that published a book which published the key to unlocking the WikiLeaks cables that were being stored in a safe place. And that's why they became published on the net. And that's why Julian got it in the neck for then later on publishing the same things to play catch up, because he was saying, I need to warn the people out there that the stuff's already out on the net. And The Guardian did that. And The Guardian also reported on the so-called visit by Paul Manafort to the Ecuadorian embassy, something that didn't happen, something that they still run as a story on their webpage now, saying, according to sources. So they got a patchy record, but you've got to remember back in the early days when they did great work with Julian Assange, and they had a pretty difficult relationship with him. I think they treated him like a walk-in colonial. They belittled him. They took his stuff and they treated him quite badly. But having said that, they actually together produced some outstanding journalism. So it's not a one-size-fits-all with The Guardian. I know many people really don't buy the paper. They hate the paper. It's a black and white view of things. I think it's more nuanced than that. And I think it depends on the reporters and the people that you're dealing with, rather than, once again, going back to this idea that there's an edifice, like the ABC, the Guardian, the this, the that. It depends on the people involved.
Thank you, Andrew. So we have a question for Jennifer now, which is why did you choose back in 2010 already to represent Assange? And if you faced any backlash in the legal world for choosing to do so?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the questions. First, just to address the point about the Guardian's reporting before I delve into that question. There was we had evidence in our extradition hearing. I think it's really concerning. Like Andrew says, the Guardian is not a monolithic organisation. There's been some excellent reporting from the Guardian, including from Ewan McCaskill, for example, on WikiLeaks issues. And the Guardian has put out some very strong editorials opposing extradition in the last few years. But of course, it was concerning that the Guardian book was cited by the prosecutor repeatedly in the extradition case, and indeed a number of our investigative journalists who gave evidence in the case impugned the credibility of the account provided in the Guardian book. And so I think it's worth looking back at the evidence that came out in the extradition proceedings about the Guardian reporting. And just to say too that Alan Rusbridge, the editor of the Guardian at the time, has come out strongly supportive of Julian and against extradition as well. So it is not a universal position at the Guardian, and certainly the editorial position of the Guardian at the moment is absolutely against extradition because they understand the implications of the case. In terms of my own involvement, look, this is, as a fellow Australian, I felt angry about the treatment of another fellow Australian by the Australian government. I felt that there were important free speech issues that were raised by this case dating back to 2010. We were worried about this very outcome. Like I said, I'm sorry to say that that what we warned about back then and have been warning about since 2010 did in fact happen under the Trump administration. And I feel, I continue to feel a commitment to ensuring a principled defense of Julian, given the free speech issues that arise with respect to his case. Now, I've had overwhelming support from the legal profession in terms of my role as a lawyer. Of course, there are naysayers and I have had blowback, but they are the exception, not the rule. And in fact, as a result of the pressure that I myself came under as a result of government action, I've been stopped at the airport. I have faced all kinds of threats as a result of US State Department action under the Clinton administration. And there's been wonderful support for me from the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, from Lawyers' Rights Watch groups. So I feel very supported by the profession on the whole. And I think it's sad that there are people who do not see the importance of this case and the importance of a lawyer's role, not just in this case, but in all controversial cases. So it's important that we defend the right of lawyers to be able to defend clients, no matter how controversial.
Benny, can't hear you.
Okay, yes. Okay, so I think this is a question for the entire panel because it's a question that leads us in the future. So they're asking, what can the public do to help the Assange case at the moment and to help Assange? So I would start with you, Peter, and then also if Jennifer and Andrew want to comment on this.
I think the main thing the public should be doing is asking journalists, what's the latest? Why aren't we hearing more? Please tell us. This is the biggest freedom of speech case going on that I'm aware of. And it's barely getting reported in mainstream Western media. And the public should be nagging their local journalists, pestering them and demanding that they report on it, because we had live coverage from the trial of Rolf Harris, daily coverage, breathless coverage from reporters on the spot falling over each other to report every moment of his court case. We barely get a mention of Julian Assange's case.
Andrew, any ideas?
Well, sure. I mean, my view, much as Peter has just put it, also contact your local MP. Don't underestimate that. I mean, really don't underestimate that. When a constituent feels motivated enough to call up somebody who they vote for, or maybe even don't even vote for, that person, the MP, takes notice. I think that's very important. I mean, I also agree with Peter's view about the coverage of the Assange case in London. It was pretty lackluster, considering how important it was. The other thing to remember, of course, is that now we've had COVID in this last year, which has just blanketed everything, And so as this recedes, hopefully there's a chance to get some clear air and to actually start pushing the strength of this argument about just what a great tragedy is, not only for Assange but for all of us as we face the problem of doing our job as journalists in this world where you can throw somebody in prison for reporting the truth about the malfeasance of government.
So, for example, like in Australia, as the public in London and the US also know, we have a very important media diversity inquiry at the Senate at the moment. And unfortunately, mainstream media are forgetting that this is even happening. The day in which the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, had the hearing, I could see only 2-3 pieces in the news because the entire world was focusing on Facebook and the media bargaining code and the saga between the Australian government and Facebook. And major commentators, of course, said that, obviously the Murdoch agenda was clearly pushing, this type of coverage instead of having a thorough discussion on the media diversity. But this is a paradigmatic and very crucial moment for Australia, but also for the UK and for the US that are all, bearing, the Murdoch media and facing this major concentration that, then leads to lack of coverage, for example, on the case of Assange and much, much more. So do you have any idea of how to try to address this issue? And for example, how can we make sure that the public is aware of the relevance of a media inquiry like the one that is happening at this very moment in Australia without the mainstream media on board?
Look, I think it's a very difficult question, an easy question to ask, difficult question to answer, because such is the 24-hour news system that the churn is so high and competition from other platforms is so immense that journalists just flick through stories so quickly. The churn rate is so high. We just need to slow down, but slowing down means that you get left behind. So, I think that when Rudd appeared, sure, there was great coverage and it did get some coverage, but the competition from other stories that people may be interested in, much as it drives us as journalists have actually a natural apprehension about reporting about themselves. They see it as actually sort of like navel gazing, it's called. They want to look out, they're always reporting about other things. And it's a bit uneasy even for me to be talking about journalism and what we are, because our job is to represent other people and to talk about them. And so when you talk about the problems of journalism, it all sounds, everybody kind of goes, well, that's what journalists are always complaining about, so we don't talk about ourselves. So that is part of the problem. How you cut through that, I don't know, but certainly Rudd did cut through, and I think that the population itself is really gets the message about Murdoch. You really don't need to bang the drum too much harder, because there are boycotts of the Australian newspaper. It barely sells anything anyway. They give them away free at airports, get the numbers up, and I think people get Murdoch. They do understand it. The question is, what do you do to rein him in? How do you change it? How do you get Labour, for example, to start understanding just what a malevolent influence he is in this country?
Peter, do you have other ideas of what to do also between now and August, for example, when the media diversity inquiry will report?
Look, I think there's development of independent media that's on YouTube channels, that's on Facebook and Twitter. I think there's other means of getting information, and sad to say, I think people need to go and search them out, because you can stay informed. It's just a lot of hard work. You can't just pick up your local paper or flick on the TV anymore to find out what's going on, or half of what's going on. You have to do the digging around yourself. And just very quickly about The Guardian, the Daily Maverick in the UK. Well, is it South Australian? South African, isn't it? I think.
South Africa, yeah.
Yeah, so the Daily Maverick published a fantastic article about how The Guardian was basically infiltrated by the UK intelligence services and swung around to the right a couple of years ago. It's a hell of a story. It's one of the most incredible stories I've ever read about how the media has been taken over by intelligence services and their fellow travellers, and I think we should read it. But the problem is it's not in the mainstream. People don't see it. I think independent media, backing them and supporting them is the way to go, because the mainstream's failed.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for that. And I think that actually the UK in this, and especially what's happening in the UK in the last couple of years, is fascinating to watch, because we have really new, incredible independent media that are actually now becoming bigger and more relevant by the day. And actually, we wouldn't be actually able to have this great media democracy festival with over 10,000, 15,000, and sometimes even like 100,000 viewers if it wasn't for this great coalition of independent media, such as the one that is supporting us tonight. So I want to close by thanking you all for a fantastic panel. And I know that we'll be posting all of this discussion, and we'll be sharing it, and we'll be making sure that we can cut through the mainstream media, through our fantastic network of independent media. So thank you for, obviously for the Media Reform Coalition for hosting the fantastic Media Democracy Festival. The Media Reform Coalition is a voluntary organization that survives mostly on thin air and some very kind donors. For these debates, we would like to thank and acknowledge the support of Byline Times, the Independent Media Association, the Canary, Soapbox, Bywire News, Manchester Meteor. And if you'd like to support the work that we do and the Media Reform Coalition does, then please follow the links on the closing. And keep joining us at the Media Democracy Festival. The next event will happen tomorrow if you are in the UK, in the climate for change, fires, floods, and media failures. Thank you very much to all.